Welcome to our presentation on pruning for gardeners. I'm Sally McNamara.
And I'm Janet Poor.
We both enjoy cutting back plants to refresh their looks and improve their health, and we'd like to share that fun. Fear of pruning might be holding you back. Some of the elements of that pruning fear are: it's too complicated, it requires special tools, it might damage the plant, it could kill the plant, potential personal injury, and resulting brush is a problem for removal. We want you to be able to overcome your fears, and we're going to give you the information to do that. By spending time listening to us, we feel you would be more confident in your yard and be able to do the following things: identify problems in shrubs and trees, correctly remove large and small branches, feel confident about when to prune a specific shrub or tree, select which tool to use when, operate safely when pruning, and then safely dispose of diseased or invasive plant material. Those are our goals for our presentation. And we hope at the end you embrace pruning in the way that we do. Plants are naturally engineered to grow. Pruning will generate a response in the plant as growing is its job. It needs to generate as much surface area for photosynthesis as possible. Pruning influences the direction in which a plant grows. Each time you make a cut, you stop growth in one direction and encourage it in another.
And I'm going to just say a little bit more here about the need for photosynthesis and how pruning affects that. Much of, like Sally just said, it needs a lot of surface area in order to photosynthesize. So if you cut too many branches and you've reduced the shrub too much, you're going to limit how much leafing out it can do, and hence it won't have a lot of ability to photosynthesize. So when we prune, we want to make sure to leave some so that it has enough ability to leaf out. Otherwise, it won't grow.
Pruning is not going to change the basic shape of a plant. It won't make a columnar tree round or a round tree conical, etc. Pruning should be done for the health and appearance of a plant, removing damaged material, opening up the crown to more light, creating a more uniform shape, and limiting the size to the space available or function desired. Good planning ahead in the purchase of trees and shrubs is the best way to manage plant size with its intended space. But many of us inherit overgrown plants, and it has been known to happen that a plant tag was not exactly accurate about mature size. Sometimes when a plant is particularly happy in a spot, it forgets to read the tag and goes ahead and explodes with growth.
So just adding to that, what Sally's saying, it's really important to think about how to buy as close to the right size plant as you can, and that might mean talking to the people selling you the plant if you're buying it at a nursery, and really finding out what's the likely full-grown size of the shrub. Generally, they're more and more available in various size ranges, so that if you'd like a yew, but you don't want a yew that's going to be 6 feet tall, it's very likely it comes in a 4 foot tall version. So it's just important to find dwarf versions of things. And when I say dwarf, it doesn't mean tiny. It just means smaller than the giant ones.
What to prune? The most important first step in pruning is to identify why this plant is being pruned and what steps will be taken to revitalize it to its best potential. Planning the cuts is important, which means knowing why material is being removed. The 4 Ds, the first reason to prune, and it can be done anytime, is for dead, dying, damaged, or diseased branches, or crossed branches, co-leaders, overextensions, water sprouts, suckers, and skirt lifting. And finally, regeneration, which can be for a tree or a shrub or a whole hedge. The 4Ds, dead, dying, damaged, and diseased, are the most immediate needs for pruning, for the health of the tree and actually for the safety of the people. We should probably add dangerous here, as well as often broken and weak branches pose a hazard to people and property beneath. Diseased material should be removed and discarded appropriately, more on that later, and the tools sterilized afterwards.
So I'm going to talk a little bit here about the next point we made, cross branching. These are just pretty good examples of cross branching, and you'll often see that if you just try to focus on cross branching and nothing else when you're thinking about pruning. Just take a look, and pretty soon you'll notice how many branches kind of grow askew and over each other and under. It's just something we need to remove, because what happens is they rub against each other, and that creates a friction point, which allows a great entry for insects to enter, and of course cause all sorts of problems. And also, when you have cross branching, you start to have leafing out in weird spots deep inside the tree or shrub, and that limits light and air from reaching the plant well or being able to pass through. So you want to keep an eye out for the cross branching, and the overall look you're creating before you cut. You'll see cross branching, and you might have to choose, okay, which of the two branches that are crossing each other do I like best? Which one looks the most natural? And then we try to take out the one that isn't really adding anything to the shrub, and it can be the one sacrificed.
Co-leaders are when a tree has two central upward branches, actually sometimes more than two, but we'll talk about two. It is best removed when the tree is young, so it can seal the cut and continue good growth on the remaining leader. Branches left to grow together can create what is called included bark, which means the bark grows into the trunk rather than creating the typical ridge between trunk and branch. The ridge strengthens the join while the included bark weakens it. Basically, two leaders create a weak joint apt to split when the tree gets taller and heavier. Storm damage at the top of a tree is very often a co-leader that was not corrected early in the tree's life. Overextension is simply a plant that's out of balance. Smoke bushes are really prone to this. They typically grow very odd, off-branching branches going in odd directions. Fortunately, smoke bush is a plant that responds extremely well to late winter pruning. This plant will, with this extension removed, will fill out and be a much more attractive plant, and it will have time to flower as well.
So I'm going to talk on this slide about water sprouts. I think water sprouts are one of the more fun things to prune because they're so obvious. What you can see here, if you look on the side on the left, especially, there's a straight branch in there. It doesn't have a nice curve at all. It's not really a natural looking thing. It looks just like a straight arrow has been shot through the tree. And that's a water sprout. I always want to call them spouts. Anyway, water sprouts, they generally just grow in a straight line, and they're probably caused by the plant being a bit stressed, maybe in need of water at some point, and it's put out extra branches in a very straight, direct way. So what we want to do is take those off always. They don't add anything to the tree. In fact, they actually they cause it to be less vigorous than those other types of branching, and they should be removed promptly. So allowing water sprouts or suckers to remain ruin the tree's shape, and they divert energy from the rest of the tree. This next slide is about suckering, which is something I just mentioned. It's a really great example. We came upon this tree. It had just what it looks like weeds around the tree. But if you get close and you compare the leaf at the base of the tree to the leaves on the tree, you'll know they're from the same tree. So basically suckering, similar to water sprouts, originate from the roots of the tree. And besides not being attractive, they divert nutrients from the tree. And with shrubs, suckers are often part of the plant growth habit, so they're not always a bad thing. That's a special point I might make. For instance, dogwoods very often will sucker, but if you're trying to create a big swath of dogwood shrubs, having some suckering isn't a terrible thing in that case, and you can keep some of them. So that's a case where some suckers are desirable if you're trying to fill out a big area. And hydrangeas will do that as well as lilacs. I'm sure you've probably seen that before.
This slide really talks about skirt lifting and shows some of the other, this is a before and after of an apple tree that we pruned. And you can see if you look at the bottom of the tree on the left, there's a lot of branches around the bottom, and on the right, we've lifted them up. This tree has also had cross branches and a lot of damage removed from it. So you can see the one on the right is quite a bit airier than the one on the left. Skirt lifting means taking the bottom branches away. They often get in the way of lawnmowers and things. In fact, the bottom branches on this tree were all damaged by mowers. So they would be an entry point for disease and insects. Another reason for lifting the skirt of a tree would make for traffic patterns underneath or for visibility. So often the lower branches of a tree are cut off to make it a more attractive or appropriate tree for the spot.
So I'm going to speak a little bit here about the benefit of pruning a plant and how it brings it back to health. In both of these shots, this up close and this far away shot, you can just see how mangled and full of branching because of not being cared for this tree is. So by removing the damaged material and all the cross branching and any water spouts, you end up with far more light inside the tree, and air can easily flow through, and you just get a much healthier plant. So that's why we call it regeneration.
And I should add that regeneration is really even more important in shrubs even than trees. We'll get to that later, but it's a real factor in shrubs. And here we have some examples of some renovation that needs doing, Janet.
Right. So these are two shrubs that typically need a good renovation pruning, especially if you've inherited them, bought a new house, and you take a look at your lilacs or your Forsythia, and maybe you just got a little bit of blooming at the tops. And same with lilacs, they can be very overgrown and have just flowering at the very top where you can't even make a bouquet to get up there, get high enough up there to get them. They're so tall. And I've done this before. In fact, that's a shot on the right of my lilac that needed rejuvenation pruning, one of the many that we inherited. So when we do renovation pruning, we look for thick older stems and sort of uneven pieces, oversized for the location, uneven shapes of the shrub in general, dead material and other problems that we could get rid of to improve the health. By doing a really vigorous pruning. So it's called renovation pruning. And that's when you can do something really kind of dramatic. Most plants that grow in this manner have older branches that can be removed all the way to the ground level, as long as younger ones are retained. So in the case of the Forsythia or the lilac, you can actually take these things really down to the very ground practically. I mean, you could leave 3 inches and leave a couple of, a few young branches, and they will respond very well. They'll actually, that season you've cut them, they won't look great. From then on, they'll have a real rejuvenated look. And so that's why we call it renovation. So it's worth the sacrifice. Both of these plants look pretty unattractive, but they got better looking as they were given some care. Here's an example also of a way you can do renovation pruning with a red twig dogwood. And it's super easy with a red twig dogwood to get some practice, because the older branches are a different color. And what we all love about red twig dogwoods is the red twig, which is something you get more of if the stems are younger. So it's a real good example of a way to renovate your dogwood easily. If you basically kneel down in front of the base of your dogwood and you look for the grayer stems, those are the ones we prune out. And it's really beneficial to do this because the younger stems, the healthier shrub, will produce more berries and provide good coverage for wildlife.
Now we're going to talk about the how to prune. Pruning is working with the plant to improve its health. There are some logical techniques to achieve this goal. At the branch collar, we don't want to leave stumps. We're going to show you a branch collar in a while. Trees are designed with a sort of a landing pad for pruning. And leaving a stump is an input option for disease and insects again. We're going to talk about the 3-cut method so that you don't strip bark off as you take off a heavy limb. We're going to talk about cutting back to a branch so that you don't leave a stub, though you cut where the where a bud is going to grow out and produce new growth. Back to the buds, because that is where you want to see leafing out, not a piece of dead branch extending. Renovation, pruning, which we've talked about a little. Shearing, which means you just cut off everything at an equal level, which we don't recommend very often, except maybe in certain hedge conditions. And then hedge pruning, which is specialized. So the branch collar is an important concept in pruning.
So I'll talk a little bit about the branch collar here. As you can see on the left side, it's easy to see sort of a ridge, and it's a swollen sort of ring between the trunk and the branch. There's actually special cells in that ring there that grow a protective cover when it's cut beyond, when a branch is cut just beyond it. But if we're not careful to leave that collar intact, it will not cover well. It will not put its own sort of scabbing over it, and there'll be no protection from insects and disease. So it's a really important concept to learn how to spot the collar and to never cut it off itself. We do not recommend spraying a cut anymore. That's sort of old fashioned, and it encourages other bad stuff, as we say. So think of the collar as being like a Band-Aid that the tree creates itself, and the wound needs air to heal well, which is, again, another reason not to spray. A little more on the collar here is it's just a little better diagram to show you really what the collar looks like versus the actual branch. And this just gives you a couple of good looks at. You can take some time later to just look at how this ridge and collar are the important things we look for, where to prune beyond. And here's a couple more examples just to reiterate. If you look at this first shot on the left, we want to cut cleanly to enable the tree to seal. Like I talked about, as you can see that ring, that's a perfect example of tissue growing over the cut and the plant's cellular defense being in place against wounds. It's healed very nicely. The one in the upper right corner here, well, you can see that too much was left, and it's unable to seal itself off because there's too much of a stump left hanging out of the collar. Not good. And then this lower right, well, this is just bad in many ways. It's bad looking for one thing, and leaving stumps leads to decay. So this poor tree would be healthier if the whole branch on the very lower left were to be taken off for starters. That whole long branch is not helping this tree one bit.
And there, and there, and maybe even there. There's just
Right.
entry points for disease at the end of every branch. Very sad. They were trying to avoid power lines, but they should have been more thoughtful to the tree.
Right. So this next slide, we're going to talk a little more in depth, finally, about how we actually make these cuts on a tree. What you can see here are some examples, and we've got 1, 2, and 3. You're probably wondering what that means. It's a 3-cut method that we're going to describe here. It's one of the most important things to learn. So people generally look at a big branch and go, okay, we're going to take that thing off right there. And they kind of want to just get right in there and start cutting. But what we suggest is starting with number 1. Number 1 is a safety measure, the first cut. It's an undercut. So we go at this branch by coming underneath it, and it keeps all the bark beyond that cut point safe from stripping by interrupting the bark right there. The second cut removes some weight off the whole branch, because very often that branch could be quite long, and you can see that it's kind of a thick branch, and it's very likely to pull down as we cut, which would indeed cause more stripping. So it gives you a way to control cut number 3 better, and ahead of the branch collar. So number 3 being last, we don't have quite so much weight in the branch, and it makes for a very nice clean cut just beyond the collar.
And this is what we're trying to avoid, where the branch strips down the bark and leaves it open for disease and insects.
Right, there's the bad version.
The bad version.
And here's another example of the 3-cut method. Well, there I am doing the undercut in this example. The majority of the branch was first removed to prevent bark tearing, and then the stubs were carefully removed, leaving the branch collar, as you can see on the right. Even on smaller branches such as these, there's a potential for tearing bark, which does long-term damage to the plant.
Back to the branch means that when you're cutting off a branch, you want to go to a logical spot on the tree. This branch should not have been cut here. It should have been cut here. This branch should have been cut at the tree too. You want to have it disconnect where it attaches. Like if you were going to cut this branch, it should be in this spot. You want to, and if you were going to cut this branch, which they should have done, it should have been all the way back to the branch collar here. So you want to go back to the branch, the closest big branch that thing you're cutting off is attached to. And cutting back to the bud is what you do when you're working with a smaller branch. You're trying to find a location near the bud, and you want to cut at an angle so that it encourages growth in that direction. So the one on the left is the best example, and the one in the middle and the end there's too much left, and then there's too little left. In the third one here, you risk cutting into the bud, which means that you'll get odd growth or not growth or damaged growth, and that isn't what you want either.
Right.
So one of the things we wanted to point out that cutting off the branches just ad hoc is not a good idea. You want to look carefully and remove the bad material, and you don't want to just chop it off, because it results in what we call witch's brooms, or it'll produce a lot of branches at the cut end, which is not the form that you want. So you want to thin the tree and not just chop it off. If you look around, you'll see examples of this, and they're very unpleasant. They aren't healthy for the tree. Janet is going to talk more about shrub pruning, which is so important.
So here again, we're going to talk about renewal, not unlike what I talked about with the dogwoods, but here's another good way to look at the difference between leaving something very thick with old and new shoots coming out of the, I shouldn't say shoots, but old and newer branches coming up, and the after from the renewal pruning. So the concept is it can be done in 2 ways. You can cut the whole entire plant to the ground, like I talked about, things that do respond well to that, like a lilac, Forsythias, there's other shrubs like spirea that will respond very well to that. So if you come out this spring and you realize the bunny has completely taken your little spirea down to the nubbins, don't worry about it. It'll come back wonderfully. That's just one that will respond very well. So you can thin it from the base, removing older stems, cross branches, and the unbalanced branches that are kind of wacky and not keeping nice form, and anything damaged or diseased, like we've talked about. When you're thinning from the base, the important thing is to remember that we don't want to take out half the plant. So let's just say we have 100 branches. We don't want to take 50 out. What we really want to do is maybe take out a third, 25, let's say, or 30% would be about right, of a shrub. In other words, we talked about leaving enough for it to leaf out and do well. So if we're going to just do some thinning, we're going to take about a third of the plant off in a season. And when we do that, it might take a few years, taking a third at a time, for this to have a full rejuvenated look. But it does keep the plant in good health each year and looking well. Whereas taking a shrub down to the nubs, well, you do have to go through at least a year to wait for that to come back. So when we do it by a third, it allows the plant also to restore its resources over the next growing season and keep its appearance at the same time. So it's nice because we don't all really just want to look at all our shrubs all trying to come back from a severe cut. But like I said, some will do fine. There's a few things that do fine. Like I mentioned, spireas, lilacs, roses will do very well. I'll talk more of that later in this presentation, and smoke bush, as Sally said, they'll take, quite a cut. But very often those things won't flower that year. And so you have to consider that in your landscape before you decide which type of pruning are you going to do.
This slide just shows what happens if you we're trying to compare basic renovation with what we call shearing. Shearing is usually not recommended because it creates a lot of growth at the point of cut, because like we said, pruning causes a response. Response is growth. What we want is growth in a all over pattern within the plant, not just on the edges of the plant. And over time, if you shear plants, you'll notice dead spots and that kind of thing. It is not healthy for the plant.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about vines. We all love flowering vines. They're kind of a great addition to a garden. They give a nice backdrop and a big swath of color, not to mention fragrance. But sometimes it's a little challenging to approach Clematis or other vines and know what to do. And it's also true of roses, what we do with roses. So I'm just going to walk us through a little sort of basics on those two subjects. We'll start with roses. Not pruning a rose is a real common cause for not having a lot of blooms. And again, this is sort of a basic approach to pruning a rose. They do prefer a nice rejuvenating prune back in the spring to about 8 to 12 inches from the ground. And if you don't get to taking it back that far severely, what you can at least look to doing is, if you're out of town in the winter, you come back and there's your rose has a lot of leaves, but there's a point in which it has no leaves. That's the point you're going to start to take a little pruning shears to it, and you're going to prune off the dead material beyond the re-leafing. It's also important just to add here that deadheading spent flowers during the growing season is going to help your shrub rose or climbing rose do better. And climbing roses should only be pruned of lateral growth, not the straight up and down growth, as in the vertical growth. So that's important to understand, that the lateral growth is especially the area to be pruned. In the clematis world, most clematis can be cut all the way back to the ground. I've been a little stingy with that because I love to have a tall shrub, a tall vine. So I sometimes get stingy with my pruning and only take it back where it isn't leafing out. So I'll sometimes wait for leafing out and prune above that. Anything that doesn't leaf out, I know that has died over winter. Sally, on the other hand, says she's never killed a clematis or a rose by cutting it almost to the ground, and she feels that it really does rejuvenate nicely. So it's really a choice thing. All you want to keep in mind is there's no point in keeping dead branches. So look for what's dead after it's leafed out.
Grapevines are a special case, and if you've ever seen a grapevine in winter, grape orchard vineyard, sorry, in winter, you see that after they've been pruned, they're practically nude. They are vigorous growers. They benefit from almost complete removal of the previous year's growth. Cut back to 4 canes and a few spurs, and there will be ample growth and fruit. The fruit grows on the old wood. That's why you leave the spurs, because that's where the fruit will be. But there'll be vines everywhere, trust me. Pruning is based on producing fruit in the current season and renewing young canes for the next year. The old canes that produce fruit this season will not produce again. The disadvantage of not pruning grapes is that they produce a lot of foliage that becomes shade, and that limits the plant's ability to set fruits for the following year. So you just end up with a jungle and no grapes. And I discovered in this research that kiwi, the hardy kiwi that we have, responds in the same way. The more pruning, the more fruit. Hedges. Hedges are a special case. Resist the urge to trim them in a straight vertical manner. They need to be handled in a sort of at an angle so that they get light, air, and rain to the bottom of the plant as well as the top. And if you really have an interest in hedges, there's a wonderful display of mature hedges, hedgerow examples at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, both materials and styles of pruning. An excellent place to visit if you're planning a hedge.
Finally, we're going to take a look at our tools, and it's always nice to have the right tools for this job. I know you might be looking at this going, oh my, do I have to have all these? But actually having really each one of these, there's a real purpose for each one, and not having the right tool for the job, it will be really frustrating. So you can't prune without the right tools. You might as well get a few of the correct quality tools. It is best to spend a little bit on the tool. Usually going cheap doesn't really do you much good. They can fall apart. We very often suggest Felco. That's a Felco pruner on the far right. Felco makes some very good pruning products or tools. And they just last a long time and are easier to use. They've got good handles. And it doesn't have to only be a Felco. The trick will really be for you to handle the tool, see how you like the feel of it. But here's the most important thing is keeping your blades sharp. So you'll want to sharpen them regularly, maybe dry them after you sharpen them, just wipe them down and maybe put a little oil on them after you've used them. And you can use a file or a whetstone for sharpening. And one thing we do want to mention is that if you're working with diseased branches and things, you would be wise to give them a wipe with some disinfectant. We know that pine sol can work, as well as Clorox wipes, just something that's got some, antibacterial kind of abilities. You'll also, as a side, want to change gloves and wash the pair you were using when you were trimming anything with disease on it. Make a switch so you don't pass that disease on to other things. And then you want to store these tools correctly. We would store them blade up, not blade down on the ground. It just causes, a lot of damage to the blade. And one little piece of advice, not that this has ever happened to Sally or I, but we sometimes do recommend, especially if you get a lot of black or green handled tools, that you get a can of brightly colored paint like neon and spray the handles. They're much easier to find in a pile of leaves when you throw them down to gather your branches and then realize you've put your tool down and can't find it anywhere. This this next one is just a little more about the particular hand pruners that we suggest. It's again a Felco. Hand pruners are where pruning really begins, and a lot of pruning manuals recommend bypass pruners as they're easier on the plant tissue. That means that the blades pass each other and instead of just mashing against each other. So that makes for a much nicer cut. The alternate type, the anvil type, like I mentioned, crushes the blade and tissue against a backstop. Not good. So what we show here is a nice Felco. They even come with a nice little case, and the blades can be replaced if you need a replacement. A case is a really great idea for a small tool like this. I wear a small tool belt. I got it like Home Depot, and it has a nice holder. Felcos also come with that leather holder you can put on your belt. So it's real helpful. I like to carry the pouch because I sometimes have a couple of small pruners. I like to use a needle nose pruner for really small branches as well. Just a little more on pruners. This, like I mentioned, this needle nose pruner on the right. It's a small pruner, but it's definitely a go-to when it comes to the smaller branches, trying to get a blade into small areas. You sometimes find it's just really handy to have something more long and pointy, like when you're going to cut rosemary, for example.
And loppers are used for the next size up. And the rule of thumb is if a branch fills the jaws of a hand pruner, use a lopper. If it fills the lopper jaws, bring out the saw. So it doesn't work to prune a branch that's too large for the pruner that you have. And obviously we were discussing before, there's different sizes of hand pruners, there's different sizes of loppers, but choose a medium size and you don't have to have too many choices. And if you need to go bigger than the saw, we really suggest you call the arborist. You notice we aren't talking about chainsaws here. This is pruning for gardeners. Most yards have enough ground level pruning to keep you busy.
The handsaw examples we're going to show you here are all just they're variation in types, but they all work. It just depends on what feels right for you. It's a really effective tool for pruning. Obviously it handles the thicker branches than the loppers, like Sally just mentioned, and it helps you achieve the over and undercuts that we do in the 1, 2, 3 method. Like I said, there's a lot of options. There's the foldable types. There's some that have the over handle that's a complete, like a hoop shape. So there's a lot of options. It's very often best to have more than one size. As you can see, the one I'm using in this picture is a fairly large blade, but you can also use a smaller smaller handle, smaller blade size for just slightly smaller branches. Just choose what's comfortable in your hand.
A pole saw can be really handy. This pole saw has both a clippers and a saw. The clipper is handled with a piece of rope. This allows you to get tall branches. And if you were to use this with a ladder, please have a partner. We would like safety to be a foremost point in your pruning. So if you're using this from the ground, great, but if you need to get up on a ladder, please have someone hold that ladder. Safety. Janet.
So this is a little tongue-in-cheek photo, a little demonstration we thought we'd put together. Here you can, it looks like Sally's looking like she went out to, maybe play in the garden and then decided, oh, heck, I need to do some pruning, but really didn't quite think it through and have the right attire. I'll point out a couple things she didn't get quite right. You want to cover your eyes, your arms, your legs, and your feet for starters. So as you can see, me on the right, looking all like I really understand what you need to wear. I've got a hat on so that things don't fall on my head. If they do, I've got some protection. I've got my eyes covered. I've got long sleeves on so I don't get completely cut up by branches. I've got the right shoe wear. It's a little hard to see in this picture, but I've got heavier shoes on. She's wearing flip-flops. And I can really go at this project in a safer way. I'm also wearing gloves. So you really want to kind of think ahead. If you're going to prune, go, okay, am I wearing the right thing to go do this? Even if the branches on the plants you're pruning don't get you, the ones next to the one you're pruning can very often be the culprit. You can lean down and lean right into a branch you weren't looking at. So a perfect example of that is a row of hydrangeas can really represent a lot of eye-poking hazards because they've got branches straight up from the ground, and you're trying to get in between a lot of very stiff branches, and it's wise to have sleeves. I've had my arms so cut up, not to mention some pokes in my face and near misses in my eye. You don't want to end up needing a trip to the ER. That's never fun.
Most pruning is done in late winter or early spring, like right now, if you're hearing this in March. Plants are dormant, but they are posed for regrowth. It's obviously easier to visualize pruning cuts when the leaves are off in the dormant season, and it's best for the health of the plant. Fallen material won't dig into frozen ground and make divots. It's a great excuse to be outside in your yard right now as well. Pruning just after dormancy in the fall is not a good time for two reasons. It can produce an immediate growth response of leafing out in just in time for the first serious frost to damage the growth, or it can leave wounds that can dry over the winter, which is bad for the plant. In spring, the plant is focusing its resources toward growth, which will cause wounds to seal quickly. There are some exceptions to the late winter pruning. Normally in the dormant season, insects and disease are not present, which is another good reason to prune then. But that's not true of cherries for some reason. Their fungal and bacterial diseases may spread during dormancy, especially on recently cut limbs. So it is best to prune cherry in early summer. It is also not true for trees such as maple and birch, which if you know anything about making maple syrup, you will understand that when they're pruned in spring, these trees can lose excessive amounts of sap because the sap is rising rapidly. Maple tree pruning in winter generally won't kill a mature tree. There would just be a lot of sap loss, but it could kill a young tree. If you can wait until later spring or early summer when once the leaf buds open, you can prune the maples and the birches because the sap is no longer under pressure and won't leak out from the pruning wounds. Another extremely important pruning note applies to oaks. While it is safe to prune them in late winter, as for most other plants, pruning any time between April and August can expose them to the beetle that carries oak wilt. Obviously, if there is storm damage during this period, the tree needs to be trimmed, but otherwise refrain from creating any open wounds in oak in summer.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about some more exceptions that are really more for reasons of enjoyment, I guess you'd say. I know I talked about Forsythia and lilac being something we can do rejuvenation pruning, and same with spireas. But this is a case where, well, you just want to do some pruning, but you're trying to decide when. So let's say it's March, April, and you're looking at that. You're looking at your azaleas, your forsythias, your lilacs, spirea, whatever. You're thinking, there's some goofy looking branches here I could get rid of. What we're going to tell you about here is why wait? Why to wait? Obviously, you're about to get some blooming that are quite beautiful. We all love having our upper left is a clethra, and we've got a flowering, looks like a mock orange possibly on the right, forsythia and lilac and spirea on the lower in the lower photos. Those can all benefit most by having a trim right after they've bloomed. There's a nice little window just after they've bloomed to get in there and give them a nice haircut. If they've got some goofy branches, give them a nice shape, get rid of the dead. And you have a few weeks, usually we suggest about 4 weeks after they've leafed out, after they've flowered, before they are going to start to set buds for next year. So that happens during, just later on in the summer. So you want to get in there after the 9-bark, the clethra, or that might be a fothergilla, I can't be sure in that picture, mock orange, all those things. You just after they've bloomed, you get out there and give them their haircut, and then you're going to leave them alone. So that way you're going to have flowers for next year. So, you can prune them in later winter if you've really got some bad looking shrub, but just know that you won't see your flowers if you do that. A little more on flowering shrubs and when to cut these. This is an example of things that flower later than spring. And I'm going to correct myself now because I know that that's a clethra in the upper section. And then on the lower left, we've got roses. And on the right, we've got a smoke bush. Summer flowering shrubs can and should be pruned in late winter or early spring. And this is because they're later summer bloomers, they aren't setting their buds until the spring of the year they're in. So many summer flowering shrubs bloom on the current year's growth. So pruning them back late in winter encourages them to produce lots of new growth that summer, and you'll get lots of flowers. This includes shrubs like I mentioned here, as clethra is a good example. Pruning late summer blooming shrubs after they flower will leave them susceptible to frost damage because they're later bloomers. And because it's first growth, like we mentioned, later when the temperatures start to drop. So that's another reason to prune these types of shrubs in the earlier spring. Shrub roses do a nice rebound, like we mentioned, after they get pruned to the ground. And they can be deadheaded and cut back a little bit during the summer as well. And I guess often the biggest pruning mistakes with shrubs is not to prune at all. So they all really benefit from some revitalization and cutting out of older stems. And again, remembering only a third of the plant each year. Hydrangea varieties. This is one of those subjects that people always are scratching their heads about because there's so many hydrangea types, as in named types. You've got your Annabelles and you've got quickfires and you've got lots of cone-shaped flowered hydrangeas, but really they all fall into only a couple of groups. And I'll give you the big example. If you've got the old-fashioned Annabelle, that's known as a snowball variety, and it's a macrophylla. Sally has Annabelles, and she knows for a fact, like most people that have them, you can take them down to the ground and they spring back up with all new growth and all new flowers by mid-season. They're just a very easy, nice Annabelle, or shall I say hydrangea, that just is a good producer of flowering. And they happen to also be one of the few that does really well with not too much sun. Most hydrangeas otherwise do want some sun, and they also grow differently than the Annabelle type. A good example might be a quickfire. Most people have heard of quickfire by now, and they're the nice rosy colored cone-shaped flowering shrub. They benefit from a different type of pruning. That one happens to grow on wood from the previous season. So when you're trimming your quickfire, you really don't have to do much other than remove the old flowers. A lot of us keep those flowers on for the winter. They give you a nice dried flower appearance, a nice winter interest. But what you like to do now is get out there and give them a haircut, at least removing flowers and perhaps any branches that are sort of not adding to a nice shape.
Conifers are a special case. Basically, whorled branches, the pines, fir, cedar, larch, spruce, they do not regenerate from cuts. The only way to prune them is to prune candles in the spring. Random branching conifers, juniper, hemlock, arborvitae, cypress, and false cypress can regenerate from dormant buds on green branches, and they may be trimmed back to the bud in early spring. You can't trim them back to dead branches if it's brown, they won't regenerate. It has to be green, has to have some buds. And this needs to be done carefully. Make sure that you're going back to a real bud, otherwise you're going to create a bald spot. So the less pruning on conifers, the better. They are sort of challenging. And this is what a candle looks like. And you want to cut off half or maybe all the candle to control the growth of a pine in particular. This is an example of evergreens gone wild. Many of us have inherited a property like this. Most of these evergreens could not be pruned back very effectively. They would just leave bare branches and stumps. So except for this one yew that maybe could be pruned back if you were willing to wait a couple seasons for it to regenerate, but the rest of them, the junipers, need to be just removed and start over. Sorry, that's the back there. One item that I really wanted to make a point of in this presentation, since I also talk about invasive plants, is getting rid of invasive and diseased plant material is a special case. Most waste material that's not diseased and not invasive can go in your regular yard bags or take it to a brush drop-off site. If you have diseased or invasive, you need to bag it properly or take it to a site where it will be composted at a very high temperature. And the DNR says it actually cannot go into your regular trash, even if it is bagged. So if you have like buckthorn or something, you want to try to get it to, and I know, for example, by having done some research is that Gertens is one of the places where you can take your waste material and they do compost it at a high enough temperature to kill insects and seeds. You can actually burn a lot of your plant waste, in a bonfire, but if you're cutting poison ivy, do not burn that because the smoke is just as toxic as the plant. And that there's the St. Paul composite site also is a site that will take it to the right temperature. Now for a little bit of the fun part of we have some quick fun slides for those overachievers out there who want to take pruning to the next level. And then we have some historical, some hysterical, and some whimsical. So pleaching and espalier. Pleaching is a creation of a hedge on stilts by training and sculpting of trees to form a flat framework above a very clear stem. The branches are shaped and pruned, often using an actual trellis type structure to form a foliage shape that appears similar to the shape of a well-groomed hedge, but with stems. So you can see under it, but not through it. It adds huge impact to a garden. And it's amazing how many examples you can find of this if you look around on the internet, not locally, sorry. An espalier is the training of a plant to grow onto a flat framework, often for the purpose of increased fruit production due to more sun exposure and ease of harvest. It obviously has decorative purpose as well. There are some really great examples of espalier in the home garden section of the U of M Landscape Arboretum. And then this can get kind of competitive if you look at some of these examples, and I didn't even show you beside, but that's where it really went crazy. And pollarding and coppicing are actually historical methods for generating fuel. As we've said, cutting a plant generates a response, and it'll grow, it'll regenerate probably weaker branches, but lots of them, and they would cut the plants, either top them or cut them to the ground. Pollarding is topping and coppicing is to the ground, and then they would regrow so that they would have fuel for the several years later. And obviously certain species respond better than others. So it was also a very effective way for harvesting wood because it was accessible. And then for those who have a lot of time on their hands, there's topiary. So we have a few little quiz items to kind of wrap up what we've been talking about. The first one is this good work or bad? In both cases, we consider this to be good work. The branch color is healing over, and in the one on the right, the arborists were very talented and did exactly, I mean, these are huge prunes, but they got them in exactly the right spot so the tree will recover. These are obviously very recent. This tree was topped, and it's going to lead to a bunch of random, lots of sprays of branches at the end of each of these branches. This tree is going to look sort of silly next season, and I'm not sure why they did it this way. These are two trees that are topped, but they both serve a purpose. The one on the left is an apple tree. This is in Bayfield, Wisconsin, both of these next ones. And many of the apple trees in Bayfield, which is known for apples, are pruned so that they can reach the fruit. And the one on the right, of course, was pruned for the lines, but they at least made the tree balance, which I thought was a plus. They probably should have taken the whole tree down, but you'd have to ask the homeowner. This tree is actually outside the Church of the Assumption in downtown St. Paul. And the problem here is it's really fun. It just would require quite a bit of work because it's going to respond with new growth, and it's going to be sort of here, there, and everywhere. It's going to look like stray branches. So you're going to have to trim it probably several times a season, but that's probably fine. They don't have a lot of them, and they're fun. Here we have an example of a lilac that was pruned all to one length. We would like to recommend against this. We hope that we've made it clear that pruning out the old dead parts of a lilac bush down to the ground creates a lot better look. You can see that this could have easily been, the big ones could have been cut to the ground and just left all the young ones to regenerate and create flowers. Those big ones aren't going to create flowers anyway, and you can actually see flower buds on the smaller branches that are young. And Janet gets to talk about when.
The question of when. And I know we've given you lots of information that is varied. So we're just going to, again, kind of give you a question here. When is the best time to prune certain things? We mentioned roses, late winter or after the first bloom for deadheading, but late winter, they really appreciate a good cutback. If you don't get around to it, you at least come out and take away the dead above where the leafing out has stopped. Clematis, late winter or right after you see the buds break open, and again, take away the dead above it. Weigela, after spring blooming. Don't do it before, you just won't get the chance to see those pretty flowers. Buddleia, butterfly bush, late winter, not after flowering, because it's a later bloomer, it's a later summer, so the new growth will be frost damaged. And this cute little bluebird, we just thought we'd put it in here, because it's cute gathering, is of course little nest materials, but why pruning is even beneficial for these guys. Even they will appreciate a good pruning job, because you'll create better leafing out, better flowering, and better fruiting. And by really improving the form of the shrub or the tree, it gives the bird better protection when nesting. This is a book that we used heavily in this presentation, and it's my book. It's called Essential Pruning Techniques by George E. Brown and Tony Kirkham of Kew Gardens in England. And it just really is well laid out, really easy to read, easy to look up the things you are trying to accomplish quickly. And it's just got a real extensive compilation of good pruning practices for trees, shrubs, and conifers.
We just thought this was a fun picture of a birch growing out of a willow. We hope you feel more confident to prune your own garden. Where we encourage pruning. Pruning is good, healthy for trees. And sometimes just trying things is the best way to learn. We take some before and after photos and spray paint your tools. Those are our last reminders. Anything else, Janet?
No, other than the sun has taken it's an opportunity to now shine straight into the shot. So it's a good thing we're ending. I'm in sunny California.
Thank you for hanging with us. We hope you enjoy pruning whichever season it's appropriate for your plant. Thank you very much.